Beatrice was bathing in the large water cauldron, and I was busy adding more firewood. Halfway through, I left to take care of something personal. When I returned, my sister had vanished from the pot. The next day, my mother was taken away in handcuffs. The entire village believed she had killed her own daughter. Back then, I lived in a small village nestled in the snow-covered hills of southern Austria. In those days, the old houses were roofed with grey stone, their walls covered in moss, and chimney smoke drifted lazily in the evening breeze. There was no hot water or modern bathrooms like in the cities. To bathe in the chilly spring, we had to heat water in a massive cast-iron pot, fixed on a brick base in the outdoor bathhouse, a time-worn tradition passed down through generations. That day, the sky was clear, and a thin sunlight spilled through the bare oak trees. I, a boy barely over 10, had begun imitating my father's manner, considering myself the man of the house. I crouched down to draw buckets of cold water from the well, filled the cauldron to the brim, then dragged out a pile of dry firewood to start a fire. When steam began to rise, I ran into the house to call my sister, Beatrice, a delicate little girl with golden hair as fragile as glass. I carefully lifted her and placed her into the warm water, letting her sit fully submerged except for her shoulders, then laid a small towel on her as our mother used to do. I sat on an old stool beside the fire pit, clearing my throat with mock seriousness. Beatrice, I'm going to begin now, okay? The fire crackled cheerfully beneath the pot. My sister smiled. Everything was normal. But then, a sharp pain twisted in my stomach. Sudden and intense, it overwhelmed me. I clutched my belly, hesitating, afraid that if I left, the fire would go out and my sister would get cold. So I shoved a big stack of wood into the fire, making the flames blaze high before stepping away. Just as I was about to leave, the wooden gate creaked open. It was Mother. She had just returned from the northern field, her hands still muddy. "Mom, I'm bathing Beatrice. Please watch the fire for me a bit. My stomach hurts." Without waiting for an answer, I ran off toward the outhouse at the back garden, leaving the blazing fire in the hands of the only adult present. That trip was truly miserable. I sat for a long time on the cold wooden bench, listening to birds calling from the deep forest. When I returned, I felt at ease, but the scene before me froze my blood. The yard was silent. Mother was nowhere to be seen. The fire had gone out. The pile of firewood was soaked, as if someone had dumped a whole bucket of water on it. Ash still smouldered, releasing a damp, mouldy stench. "Beatrice." I called. No answer. I stepped around the small wall that enclosed the bathing area. Before me was nothing but an empty cauldron, the water still, mirror-like, not a single ripple. No Beatrice. No towel. No familiar giggles. I panicked and tore through the backyard. I called out across the garden, crawled into the woodshed, turned over piles of straw, every old wooden crate. But my sister had vanished as if swallowed by the earth, as if she had never existed. When night fell, my mother still had not returned. Uncle Wolfgang and his wife arrived in a state of panic, moving about like shadows. My father sat in a chair, head bowed low, his hands clenched tight as if nailed to his thighs. "Where did you hide the girl?" my uncle shouted, grabbing my father's collar, eyes bloodshot with fury. My father only shook his head, lips trembling, unable to speak. We called the police. The next day, the entire village of Fischbock was searched, from the ancient cemetery to the stream banks, even the church basement. They found nothing. Not a trace. Not a single strand of hair. Not a drop of blood. But then, my mother walked into the police station in the neighboring town on her own. They locked her behind cold iron bars. When I arrived, She was already there, slumped over, her hair tangled, whispering something to the officer in a grey uniform standing beside her. I called out, "Mom!" She looked up, and then she screamed, a terrible, soul-tearing scream that shattered the air. "My child, be careful!" I froze. Her eyes at that moment were like a frozen nightmare. Her lips quivered, but the iron door had already slammed shut. A sharp, unforgiving sound, and my mother vanished from my sight. From that day forward, that young mother and my porcelain doll sister were sealed forever in the silent memories of my childhood. It took me many years to truly understand what my mother saw behind me that day, and what she wanted me to be careful of wasn't the fire. It wasn't the water. It wasn't the pain. A few hours after she was detained at the Altenburg station, a team of local police was dispatched to a desolate hill outside the village of Fischbach. They erected a temporary steel fence around the area, stark white against the floating fog. I stood dozens of meters away, peering through the gaps in the mesh, watching them dig. The heavy iron shovels tore into the hardened soil. They looked as if they were trying to unearth something buried deep, something they hoped not to find. Grandmother pulled me away when she caught me sneaking a look. I never saw what they dug up. Only the sky above remained, grey and silent like a coffin without a lid. Much later, I heard from the villagers. What they unearthed was Beatrice's body. That news struck like a blade through my childhood memories, cold and lingering. The rumour spread across the village like a winter avalanche. They whispered in the bakeries, the churches, around the village well, Clarice killed her own daughter. Clarice boiled the girl in the pot. A neighbour, old Gretel, known for her fur hats and ceaseless gossip, murmured to the women washing vegetables by the stream. The girl's flesh was already rotting, the bones were sticking out. I crept closer to the group of adults, hiding behind the trunk of an elm tree, straining to hear every word. One of them said, "I saw Tight Mai, no, in German she's called Matilda Mare, carrying a large sack past the fence behind the house. Looked very suspicious. When I asked, she said she was selling potatoes." I knew something was wrong. Now that I think about it, she must have been carrying the girl's body. Yes, a white sack. Very big. She dragged it up the hill, walking fast like the devil was chasing her. I couldn't believe my ears. Matilda, my mother's closest friend? Or her accomplice? The next day, the police came back to our home. They searched quietly, thoroughly, every nook and cranny. They lingered long at the outdoor bath area. One old officer crouched beside the cast-iron pot, using tongs to lift something small and glimmering from its bottom. Another lay flat on the grass near the ashes, lowering his nose to sniff, then shoveled a piece of earth into a sealed evidence bag. "The bath water was poured here afterward," one of them said, his voice low, as quiet and cold as a winter wind, enough to make anyone shiver. At first, the officers' faces looked confident, but as time went on, their expressions turned more and more confused, increasingly disturbed. "This can't be. It can't be like this. We'll wait for the lab results," they muttered to each other, faces pale as the season's first snow. I sat by the doorway, pulling at dogtail grass, unable to understand what they were afraid of. At the time, I was still too young to realize, even the police couldn't explain what they had found. That night, inside the main house, the oil lamp cast twisted shadows of people across the walls. Uncle Wolfgang screamed, overturning chairs and tables. Why did she kill my daughter? Why? My father locked me in the bedroom. I only dared to peek through the door crack. I saw him, a tall, quiet man who usually stared at the floor, now kneeling on the wooden boards, blood dripping from his forehead. He kept banging his head against the ground, again and again, as if trying to punish himself. Why? My uncle's voice choked with grief. Was it because I once hurt her? At that moment, my father suddenly grabbed my uncle's arm, blocking a punch mid-air. It was the first time in my life I saw him fight back. No words. Only fury, guilt, and memories no one dared to touch. After everything, there was only one person left I could ask, the only one I trusted, my grandmother. She sat on the bed, fingers counting her worn-out rosary beads. The candlelight flickered across her faded eyes. I asked in a whisper, "Grandma, where did Mom go?" She was silent for a long time, then finally looked at me without blinking. "That afternoon, what were you doing?" "I was bathing Beatrice." "Then your mother came home, you went to the toilet, and after that, both your mother and sister were gone." I clutched the hem of her wool sweater. Did Mom really make her disappear? She turned away. Her voice was like wind blowing through a graveyard. I was asleep. I don't know. The next morning, before the sky even lit, my father woke me up. No explanation. He packed a few things in an old frayed suitcase. He took my hand and led me to the foggy bus stop outside the village. We left Fishbock in the dark, boarded a small bus to town, then transferred to a larger one headed for Vienna. I, a 5-year-old child, left behind the old village with its bathing pots, its stone house, and a memory sealed in silence. Later, whenever I looked back, I couldn't stop the chill running down my spine. As I grew older, I realized the fear from that day didn't lie in the blood, or even death. It lay in the things unseen. Back then, I was just a 6-year-old child, innocent and eager like any other on a cold afternoon. I rushed to light a fire with the damp twigs my mother had chopped that morning. I was only afraid that Beatrice would be cold. She was very sensitive to the chill. I remember she shivered when her skin touched the water. But on the other side of the rotting wooden wall, inside the ancient stone bathroom, my sister was groaning, writhing in pain without a single call for help, though I hadn't heard it at the time. I remember running to the stone outhouse at the end of the garden, my stomach churning from a vague fear, and the soup Mother had made that morning. Meanwhile, Mother, Clarice, was tidying up the kitchen when she noticed the fire blazing outside. She panicked and ran out. And then, she stepped into the bathroom. That moment was when everything changed. The history of my family, or perhaps the very blood in our veins, branched off into something dark. I don't know what my mother saw in that pot of water. I've never dared to ask. But I know, she was so horrified she couldn't even scream. Her face, when she returned outside, was pale as the marble statues in the graveyard. Her hands trembled, almost beyond her control. Uncle Wolfgang, my mother's younger brother, had a temper, and he loved Beatrice more than life itself. If he had seen that scene, I'm sure I would have been beaten to death, or strangled right there in our backyard. And so, my mother made a decision. In the silence cold as ice that settled over the slate-roofed house, my mother trembled as she lifted the thing out of the pot. She took a black cloth, wrapped it around that thing, and sometime during the night, perhaps with Matilda Mare, the woman who had carried a sack up the hill, she went to bury it. The next morning, Mother went alone to the police station in the town of Bad Iskall, nearly 30 kilometers from our village, and took all the blame upon herself. My fragments of memory, once a chain of hazy images like sketches in charcoal, suddenly shattered, falling piece by piece like ice breaking in a half. A sound rang in my head, shrill and piercing like glass being scraped, and I screamed uncontrollably. I curled up in bed, in our tiny apartment in Vienna, trying to remember, trying to recall the exact moment I last saw my mother. I had stood behind the cold iron bars at the police station. I looked at her through a small window. She opened her mouth and, with all her strength, let out a scream that tore through her lungs. "My child, be careful." Wait. Something wasn't right. Be careful. She was warning me. But about what? About who? I had always thought she only pretended to confess, to keep me from being involved. But why did she look so terrified? Why was her face contorted with such horror, a fear not for herself, but for me? Even someone facing execution doesn't wear such a twisted expression. Mother wasn't looking at me. She was looking at something behind me. That tiny detail, her eyes, pierced through the version of memory I had once believed to be true. If she really confessed to protect me, she should have remained calm, tried to act normal so the police wouldn't suspect anything more. But instead, she screamed in despair. Not to plead, not to beg forgiveness, but to warn. I jolted upright in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat, though the winter room was so cold the windows fogged with my breath. There was something I had missed. A vital detail. A missing link that could drag everything into a darker chain of logic, darker even than fear itself. I closed my eyes and began to retrace it all. Every image, every sound, starting from the pot of water, from the old limestone bathroom, from the cries of pain no one heard, from the look in Mother's eyes.